I know we all needed an extra cup of coffee this morning. Welcome back to the Missing Piece Symposium. I don't need to remind any of you that it is Saturday, February 16th, but just in case. Hello to our webcast audience, and welcome back to our audience here at the United States Institute of Peace. My name is Kathleen Keenest, and I'm going to be co-moderating with my colleague, Dr. Dara K. Cohen of Harvard University. I just wanted to say a few words to bring to your attention on this panel this morning on methodological challenges and opportunities. This is really a wonderful opportunity for young scholars and senior scholars to come together and compare notes and create a dialogue with all of you about what are some of the most innovative approaches, some of the ethical issues, and of course the methodological challenges. But I wanted to draw your attention to the panel in that we have 4 young scholars represented. And again, we have through this network, the Symposium, and through additional funding from Open Society Foundation, created a young scholar network. You might ask, what is a young scholar network? One of the gaps that we see in the constellation of conflict-related sexual violence is that it is very much a siloed investigation. And it's even siloed in academia. So you have an association meeting of political scientists or international relations or anthropologists, and maybe one panel will be addressing this issue of sexual violence. So one of the gaps we found was that we needed to bring folks together, young scholars, so that they could create kind of a centrifugal force and be an association, a network, a community of practice. So this afternoon, after our formal symposium concludes, there is a special session for these young scholars. And Dara is going to be our moderator, and she's going to introduce the panelists and take note of her Young Scholar Network colleagues. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Dara. Thank you very much for doing this morning.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's really a pleasure to be moderating this panel this morning. And I wanted to also echo what Kathleen said and say thank you so much to the members of the audience for coming out so early on a Saturday morning to talk about methodological issues. We say in the political science world that we know the panel is a success if there are more people in the audience than on the stage. So by that metric, this is already a smashing success. So thank you so much. So the panel this morning is focused on kind of 2 overarching themes or questions, and we'll be addressing these over the course of the next 2 hours. The first question is, what types of data are still needed for researchers and policymakers to better understand the problem of sexual violence in wartime? And secondly, how can scholars, advocates, and practitioners who are interested in researching this issue and in creating policy to address this issue best inform and support each other? So to help us explore those questions, I'm going to briefly introduce the members of the panel today. To my left is Dr. Mary Ellsberg of the International Center on Research on Women at George Washington University.
No, sorry, the Global Women's Institute. I used to be at ICRW.
Oh, okay, apologies, the Global Women's Institute. To her left is Dr. Amelia Hoover-Green, assistant professor at Drexel University. Next, Dr. Lynn Lowry of Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. Next, Dr. Ragnhild Nordas, senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo. Matt Stiermer, a PhD candidate at The Ohio State University and a principal investigator for the WomenStats database project. And lastly, Dr. Shauna Swiss, the founder and director of Women's Rights International. So our plan for this morning is to have each panelist make brief 3 to 5 minute introductory remarks. There will be 3 to 5 minutes at the absolute maximum, which will then leave us about half an hour to go back for a second round where I'll ask each of our panelists a couple of questions about their research and some of the themes for today. That will leave us with an hour for questions from the audience, and we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. So let's get started. Mary?
Okay, thank you. So these last 2 days have been incredibly interesting and compelling, and I think that they have raised a lot of questions in my mind and in probably everybody's mind. One of the conclusions that comes to me is that clearly we need a lot more evidence. We need it for our advocacy work, we need it for monitoring and accountability, and we also need it for improving our service provision and for prevention of violence. And what we've seen in the last few days is that there's not very much consensus right now on some very basic issues, one of which is who are the victims of sexual violence, what constitutes sexual violence, who are the perpetrators, and what is the magnitude of sexual violence in conflict. And we've seen differences in the way it's been presented, even in some of the same communities and the same conflicts. And so clearly we need to find ways of making these different methods and data speak to each other and being able to make sense out of it. A few things that I've understood from the discussions that might be underlying these differences. One is clearly there is a huge amount of variation in the magnitude and the characteristics, and even in who the victims and the perpetrators are, and that varies a lot by communities, by countries, and that's something that we really need to be mindful of. Another point that's come up that I think is very important is what it means to be focusing so narrowly on sexual violence and conflict in our research. And I think there's 2 problems that I see. One is that, as has been mentioned, that it obscures other forms of violence and conflict that victims may be experiencing. And many of these forms of conflict, of violence, may be as traumatic or even more traumatic and harmful than specifically the sexual violence. The other issue is that focusing specifically on sexual violence in conflict obscures other forms of gender-based violence that individuals are experiencing both during the conflict, before the conflict, after the conflict. And several studies have shown that women are raped during conflict, but they're also being beaten by intimate partners and other family members. That's happening during the conflict. It happened before the conflict. It will continue to happen after the conflict. And often we don't see that because we're so focused on these one specific set of acts. That brings me to the suggestion that we need to focus more on individuals as a whole and on communities as a whole rather than on specific acts of violence. Finally, the issue of the methods and the definitions, I think, is something that we really need to work on. And as I said, part of the variation is true variation. Part of the variation in our findings has to do with the fact that we're measuring violence in different ways. We're talking to different people. We're sampling in different ways. And we're using different methods to talk to people and to encourage disclosure. And so that's something we really came across with when we started doing research on intimate partner violence 15, 20 years ago. And many of those original researchers are here in the room. And we found that we couldn't compare the data across countries. And the key thing to do was both developing the ethical guidelines, which we'll talk about more later, but also to be clear that we're talking about the same acts and the same issues. And so clearly we need a lot more of that. I think the research agenda that was developed by WHO, MRC, and the Stop Rape campaign is a really good summary of a lot of these issues that we could speak to. The final point that I wanted to make was around this sort of dichotomy of do we need more data or do we need to act now? I think we need both. I don't think that not having the data should ever be an excuse for not acting. So clearly, as the violence begins, and as we know, the priority should be getting in and providing services to victims. And the research should come in appropriately as possible, as needed. And we do need population-based statistics as well for all of these reasons I've just given. And I will stop there.
Great. Thank you so much. Amelia.
All right. I'm a political scientist, as are several of us on the panel. And the reason I start with that is to sort of preface the fact that a lot of what I say is going to be based on sort of my goal as a political scientist, which is attempting to explain variation, both on the sort of micro level within countries and on the macro level, in the forms of wartime violence that fighters, specifically fighters, use against non-combatants. So that perspective, that idea that the goal is to test causal theories about explaining variations in patterns of violence will inform a lot of what I have to say. I also want to make a note before I talk about numbers for a long time that I both use and respect and value qualitative research, and have written as much. And now I'm going to go back to my extended discussion of numbers and how they can lead us astray. So an obvious thing to start, which is that our measurements don't necessarily reflect the wider patterns that we're looking for. To put it another way, rape reporting, trends, patterns in rape reporting, sometimes reflects trends and patterns in rape. Sometimes it reflects trends and patterns in reporting. And we don't have, in a lot of situations, a great way to distinguish between those two dynamics, let's say. And of course, patterns of reporting, in my experience working both sort of as a consultant to the human rights community and as a seeker of data in the social sciences, patterns of reporting reflect so many things. They reflect the incidence and prevalence of rape and sexual violence. They reflect shame and stigma. They reflect social networks, access, logistics, funding, staffing, political goals, conflict intensity, population movement. I wrote a long list, which I'm not going to finish. And I guess my main point today is that as researchers, both in the academy and outside the academy and the policy community, we got to be sort of searchingly honest when we assess our data. Otherwise, we run the risk of doing people harm who we're trying to help. And I think that is especially true in the context of the incredible rhetorical power of numbers these days. The note here says, cite Security Council Resolution 1960. Numbers have become kind of the coin of the realm, and not necessarily. I don't think that's for the best. I think that multi-method research is really important, but given that it's so, there are some things we ought to do. So the question always is it reasonable to make an inference from your collection of data to a wider population? And I want to talk about a couple of examples briefly. We might, for example, analyze police data and make the surprising inference that police are committing very few acts of sexual violence. We might find and report that there's more sexual violence in town X over here than town Y over here, when in fact town X has better reporting, right? And as I've said, a lot of things can affect that. And those sorts of mistaken inferences can happen on a micro level, the sorts of things that I've just talked about within countries, can also happen on a macro level. I've written some about the Human Security Report's claims about sexual violence, trends and patterns. I won't say more here, but I would talk about it later. So the thing that I want to highlight, I think, when we're talking about trends and patterns on sort of a broader population level, I've sort of come to the conclusion that our best bet in terms of making solid inferences from samples to populations is carefully sampled survey research. And that said, we don't have a lot of evidence, and I'm not sure how we would get a lot of evidence. I think that's a conversation that needs to be opened about how patterns of reporting to surveys vary. I think they're better than patterns of reporting that we see to various convenience data sources. But we don't know. We really do not know how patterns of underreporting vary across populations, across regions, et cetera, on rape surveys or sexual violence surveys more generally. And I'll just close by saying that I really do think that that is an important thing to consider as we're making policy and as we're doing advocacy. The ways that we define the problem, the ways we talk about who is affected, where they're affected, how people are targeted, if people are targeted, et cetera, they really affect how we target resources and how we target interventions. So, my research suffers when I don't do a good job being creative, thinking about the biases in my data, but that's sort of the least of it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Lynn.
So as Amelia said, she's a political scientist. I'm actually a recovering physician. I'm also a population-based researcher, and I've been told many times that I'm a lightning bolt for controversy. So I'm going to continue that. Maslow has an amazing saying. His saying is, dispassionate objectivity is itself a passion for the real and the truth. Now, I find it interesting that gender-based violence research doesn't follow that. And why is that? If you look around the room, and if you believe US statistics on gender-based violence, 25% of the females in the audience and about 7 to 8% of the males are survivors of sexual violence. I would hazard to guess that those of us that work in sexual violence, that the rates are probably higher. That's good and that's bad. It's good in that we get it. It's bad in that we may apply emotion and not have dispassionate objectivity in our research. So we inherently bias our research. And I don't want to date myself, but my mentors lived through the women's rights eras where we fought for inclusion and funding and acknowledgement of women's issues, where we were able to get insurance to cover women's issues, where maternal mortality was an issue, where gender-based violence was finally on the record. But that data wasn't gender neutral, and I think, I don't have to be a lightning bolt here. We heard yesterday, there are female perpetrators and there are male survivors. And because we're only looking at it now, I think we've done a huge disservice by not being gender neutral in our research. And as researchers, we are supposed to be neutral. We can have hypotheses, we can have biases, but we're supposed to make sure that our data and our research doesn't have biases or that we control for them, or at least we put it in our limitations and say, this is why I can't say this about the data, this is why this data didn't show what we know to be true. We fall into the trap of advocacy and agendas. And I, as a recovering physician, and now a recovering researcher, will say that I fell into that trap too. If you look at the work that we did early on, we only interviewed women. It wasn't until we started looking into the data where we asked women about their experiences in conflict, sexual violence and conflict, but we also asked about the household, that we realized that women were reporting that household males had suffered sexual violence. Then I had to say, okay, then we need to be interviewing men as well. So I fixed that in our data. We've also never asked the sex of the perpetrator. We assumed that the perpetrator was of one sex. It wasn't until my statistician, who many of you probably know, Jana Asher, said to me one day, she said, Lynn, you really need to ask the sex of the perpetrator. And I had to sit back and think about that, but from a medical perspective, you do need to know the sex of a perpetrator. You need to know whether it was intercourse or whether it was instrumentation. The consequences and the health consequences, the treatment, the medications you give don't follow if you just make assumptions about who the perpetrator is and you assume that it was rape and that it wasn't instrumentation. We also have fallen into the trap of what will get noticed, what will get into the news. In the course of my career, CNN 24 hours a day, and now everybody's news 24 hours a day. We need to get noticed. Why do we need to get noticed? Because it's hard to find funding for research. It is particularly hard to find funding for population-based research on a whole. It's easier to find funding for qualitative, I think, in some cases, because it's not as large, it's not as logistically difficult. And so many of us have fallen into the trap of saying, okay, we won't research here, but we'll research here because we know we can get the media attention, we can get the grassroots attention, or we can get the policymakers' attention, which I'll talk about later. But using different methodology is important. I'm not saying that population-based is the be-all and end-all of research. I also do use qualitative data. And in some cases, we've had to go back when we've gotten something that we didn't quite understand to go back and do further qualitative data to say, I don't understand why I'm seeing so many female perpetrators. And we have to search out to figure out what that means. Or we have to go back and interview the men who told us things such as the health consequence of their sexual violence was pregnancy. How is it that he got pregnant? Well, when we went back and asked him, it wasn't. He was what we would call a bush husband. And in being so, a bush husband, he was subject to sexual violence or sex that he didn't particularly want with a female commander. She got pregnant, she took the child and left, and he didn't know his son. So his health consequence, per his understanding, was that pregnancy, because that was the box that we had checked. So again, we have to ask more questions, and sometimes we have to go back and qualify our data. Sole reliance on one method, I think, is folly. Too many reports that I've seen, too many policy decisions have been made on focus group data or qualitative data or focus group data and qualitative data. It's rare that you see population data, and I'll talk more about that when I talk about reporting. And we have to also remember that we bias our data when we present our data with hyperbole. And it's very easy to go in to start reporting your data and writing up this piece to be published. And we want to put, it was extreme, it was the rape capital of the world, it was whatever word you want to use. It doesn't do data justice. It becomes then passionate instead of dispassionate objectivity. And I think I have to agree with Chris. The rhetoric has to stop. We can't use terms and make claims that disproportionate is true. The only reason that women suffer disproportionately is because in the beginning we didn't ask men. And we still don't know what the proportion is. And we still need to refine our research to better understand what it is. And we need to make it gender neutral. And not only do we need to make it gender neutral, but we as researchers need to be gender neutral and to stick to how we were trained as researchers.
Great. Thank you. Ragnhild.
Okay, thank you, Dara. So for the introductory remarks, I wanted to make 3 main points. Some of them have been touched upon already by some of the other panelists, but I will stick to my plan of these 3 points. So the first point that I wanted to make is the importance of having data that allows for comparative studies across a universe of cases. We have to look not only at those cases where there's clearly a high prevalence of sexual violence, we also need to look at those cases where sexual violence was less common. I think that only by making the comparisons of these different types of settings can we really draw clear inferences for understanding the phenomenon of sexual violence. Elizabeth Wood, who spoke here yesterday, has made this point several times, but I think it's worth repeating. Of course, some of the cases that draw a lot of attention because of the high prevalence of sexual violence are very important to understand because they are as severe as they are. But for us to understand really the things that we think is driving the high prevalence in these cases, we need to compare it to something. For instance, if we, by looking only at those cases with high prevalence of sexual violence, seem to think or get the impression that in all these cases, ethnicity, for instance, plays a very important role in explaining the sexual violence. And so we draw the conclusion that ethnicity explains sexual violence or some sort of ethnic dimension to the conflict. We don't really know that until we've looked at a broader set of cases to see in those cases where there's low or no sexual violence or very little sexual violence, is ethnicity also an important factor in these conflicts? So by looking at the broader set of cases, we can put our explanations to a tougher or the necessary test to see if our explanations hold. So that was my first point. And the second point has also been mentioned already. It's the importance of clear definitions. So I think in order for us to not only produce knowledge, but accumulate knowledge, we need to be very clear on what we're talking about. So if we are talking about rape, or we're talking about a broader set of behaviors, sexual violence, then we are, if our research draws some strong conclusions about sexual violence as a broad phenomenon, then it might not hold for the subcategories within that sort of bigger concept of sexual violence. So I think in order for us to understand how a result travels from one study to another study, we need to always be very clear on how we've defined the concepts we use. I also think that we know already that the different forms of sexual violence that are observed might have different causes and also different consequences. So for us to accumulate knowledge here, we know we need to make note of these differences and always specify that very clearly. If we don't do this, then we risk that the differences that we see between different studies and different findings is more a result of the difference in the concepts we use and the definitions we use than in actual content. Related to this point about the importance of clear definitions is where I think I would like to recommend is the use of a gender-neutral definition of sexual violence. This has also been talked about already at this meeting. Very often, we want to, or we see the need to study sexual violence through a gender lens. And I think as soon as we build gender into the definition of sexual violence, then we can't really use the gender lens. So the gender lens becomes less useful in our research. So for us to study how gender plays a role in sexual violence, we need to take it out of the definition of the behavior itself. So we also know, of course, that there are both male victims of sexual violence and female perpetrators. So that also emphasizes the point of the importance of gender-neutral definitions. Now, the third point I wanted to make was relates a little bit to the silo that was mentioned in the beginning. Yes. It's important that we situate sexual violence in relation to other behaviors in conflict. For us to be able to get sexual violence, say, on the research agenda as well, the data that we use and the findings that we have to be able to be related back to other things that are going on. So in the work that I've been doing on sexual violence, it's been important for me that we use the same data sets on conflicts and conflict actors that are used in other parts of peace research, so that other people within other parts of peace research can use sexual violence data in their work, and so that we can all sort of, more forces can be brought to understanding the phenomenon.
That's
yes,
great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Matthew.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Women's Stats Database. I also reiterate a few of the points and hopefully build on those that have already been mentioned on the panel. And rather than some specific points, kind of painting a broad picture of some of the issues that we face in scale creation and comparable data on the issues of sexual violence and violence in general in conflict and in broader settings. So with these issues that we face collecting and working with data regarding any stigmatized violence, they're legion. It's been reiterated at the conference many times already, but it bears repeating that violence against women or any vulnerable population is not the problem itself, but rather a symptom of a system of hierarchy and dominance in place long before the observed events. And these root causes must not be considered resolved by the mere absence of violence, although the absence is certainly going to be a preference. I want that to happen. But the root problems have to be addressed. So a few of the challenges that we face as we collect data through the Women's Stats database, there are also a few different opportunities. So first I want to outline a few of the challenges and then some of the opportunities. Regarding the data collection process, there are several issues that need to be addressed aside from the general lack of funding, the political will, data that is collected is not standardized. There's also kind of an expectation that we might not ever have it perfectly standardized. Various cultures and circumstances are going to require a great deal of variation and understanding of how we actually collect that information, and the routinization and standardization of things can limit our ability to truly understand what's actually going on in that particular environment. We have to be sensitive to that. So the problems being researched are vastly different in these different contexts, and we need to develop an understanding of how do we bring that out from their voice, their perspective, and then from that point create comparable data sets to work with. And as if all of these problems were not enough, we must also consider our target audiences. Qualitative and quantitative data must be translated into something that's meaningful for specific organizations or purposes. We reject the notion that qualitative data is just stories, but we also acknowledge that this is a widespread and rooted in the reality of limited funding. We also reject that numbers will, without proper context, inherently tell us something meaningful. At a minimum, we need to be able to rank order information, but if we lose either the context or the understanding that the data only represents kind of a latent variable of something else, then we're going to draw improper conclusions. But at least if we can get to some type of a rank order, there's the ability to perform some type of aggregate studies as long as it hasn't lost the important context. Now, on the positive side, all of these tragedies and atrocities, they're no longer born in complete isolation or solitude. There are tens and hundreds of thousands of individuals, including all of you, who work tirelessly to understand these issues and to minimize the challenges faced by women and vulnerable populations around the world. Now, somewhat paradoxically, all of this effort creates another problem. All too frequently, that expert opinion and that knowledge remains locked up within specific practitioners' heads, dispersed reports, academic journals. We all know how popular those are to read at night, bedtime material, right? So that information, we lose the moral weight of all of that information that we could bring to bear on facing these challenges, changing policies, changing how we actually address these issues. So last point then on some opportunities from our perspective. From the Women's Stats database, it's not just about data collection, it's the development of a community of women's security scholars. All of the knowledge that you possess needs to be combined with the tens of thousands of other pieces of information so that weight, the weight of justice, that morality of those experiences cannot be easily dismissed. Which leads to a second point, that websites like Women's Stats provide an opportunity to address a moral proximity paradox, and that is we're often too only concerned with those people who are physically and socially close to us and ignore those that are both physically and socially distant from us. By aggregating this information, we can begin to use technology to cross those lines. And then regarding kind of best practices, rather than...
Do you want to come back to that?
Of course.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. I'm an activist and a community organizer first, and I have an inner physician, I like that yesterday, that also plays into the kind of work I do. And I'm going to use my time to give an example of
how we can get reliable population-based data in a highly contextualized and nuanced form when we work with local teams over an extended period of time and work with them to find out what they want to know, what's important to them, what is relevant and meaningful in their conflict that they want to address. So we use a participatory action research methodology, and it's grounded in the knowledge of the local team, and it builds their capacity to design research, conduct it, interpret it, and use it in ways for their own advocacy and program development. And we link the research with programs, and we heard about that yesterday as well. And we think that's really important part of this. And we put the research findings back into formats that local people can use regardless of their level of literacy. So we do that in several tiers so that we can publish it in JAMA and send it to the UN, but also that women who've never been to school know what the data says and they know how to use, they can use it for their own purposes. So I'm going to give an example of a survey we did a long time ago in Liberia as a way of, one of the ways, and to highlight some of the things that we do. So it was a random sample survey of 205 women in 4 different kinds of settings. And I want to emphasize the idea of settings because I think it lets us disaggregate our data in the end and look at what happens to different populations, smaller populations. So we have teen data, we have adult data, but we can also break that down to what happened to teenagers that were in high school, going to high schools, as long as they were operating during the war. What happened to the teenagers that weren't in school but that were living in the community? And we found quite a lot of variation in those, as well as with adult women living in displaced persons camps and young girls living in displaced persons camps. Their experience different from women living in communities in the urban capital of Monrovia, different from the experiences of market women who crossed internal and external borders throughout the war. So to lump all that together, we have a statistic, we have a figure. We can say this much violence happened to women in living within the capital city of Monrovia. We weren't able to leave this city, but it's so much richer to be able to look at these specific groups. So Monrovia had about 700,000 people or more living in the capital. And I'm now talking about the early part of the war, the first 5 years of the war. That was more than a third of the entire population living in Liberia, taking into account that several 100,000 had already fled to neighboring countries. And so a little bit about the methodology that we use. So we pay attention to the composition of the research team. Sometimes we find a team or hire a team. Sometimes we find a local team that's already together. But we also pay attention to the context. So in the Liberian context, the early part of the war had targeted several ethnic groups. So diversity on the team was critical. And we put together a team of 6 women that represented 5 ethnic groups, 3 religions. They spoke 9 of Liberia's 16 languages. And we went for as much diversity as we could get. Age, sex, occupation are all important items when we're putting together a team. So the team was composed of nurse midwives. We couched this as a health survey, a primary healthcare survey, which gave us sort of unexpected protection as well as legitimacy in the end. And it's time? 1 minute. Okay. All right, well that's, okay, so what are some of the other things? I will just go through this rather quickly.
We'll be coming back.
We'll come back and I'll fill it all in. So
one takeaway from
one
this.
takeaway. 2 takeaways. We looked at the continuum of sexual violence. So and because I want to talk about the fact that when you do a survey like this on any sensitive issue, if you're going to talk about how many people were killed or whether your house was destroyed, that doesn't change. But on sensitive issues, people's perceptions and attitudes change over time. So you're getting a snapshot right now, how many people did this happen to? So our continuum of violence included rape, forced to have sex because of the conditions of war. We also included, although we didn't report on it, the question was written, did you love to any soldier, fighter, or peacekeeper because you saw him and you liked him? So we were going for voluntary, what women, we thought it was coercive, but if we had only asked about coercion, we would have missed all of those women. So we wanted to count that. And the reason that we did is because over time, I think people's perceptions change, and people who see something as a voluntary relationship may then later see it as a coercive relationship. So that's one point. And I'll talk about languaging later and some of the rest of it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for such an interesting first round. So for our second round, I'm just going to pose a brief question to each of our panelists, and I just want to ask you again to be as brief as possible. Maybe give one example or 1 point so we can turn to the audience and leave a full hour for question and answer. So we're going to start with Amelia. Amelia, you spoke before about the process of drawing causal inferences. So I wanted to ask you to choose an example of a case where incomplete data has caused us to draw some either incorrect or problematic inferences.
Oh, there are so many examples of that. And I'm going to break the rules and give two. Sorry, I'll be fast though. A thing that I want to point out is that this, incorrect inferences happen on a lot of levels. So in particular, one of the things that is endemic to political science is that we ask about patterns of violence, right? What causes violence against civilians, and then measure that as the number of killings. And this, needless to say, creates some problems. First of all, there's a whole separate issue of the extent to which convenience data on killings are accurate, or the extent to which some sets of convenience data on killings are accurate. There's another issue, which is that killings, as it turns out, don't correlate well to sexual violence, we think, based on the best evidence that I can muster now. And that is sort of those are the primary dynamics, I thought, behind the sort of frustrating, ongoing, and ultimately not so useful debate about is sexual violence on a global scale rising or declining that many of us were involved in late last year. The second example is much more micro, and I'll be fast. And it comes from conversations with NGO folks in Colombia as I was putting together a volume that I wrote with two co-authors a couple of years ago. And in this particular case, what we saw was in one region, certain localities had been the site of increased, let's say, leftist organizing, whether that is leftist in the sense of the FARC insurgency or just leftist. And as a component of that, some really wonderful work in terms of raising awareness, encouraging women to speak out against about sexual violence that they had suffered. And I bracket that for a moment to say, I think that it is so correct that we should be asking beyond women. But let's just go back to that for the moment. So in this particular case, we have a pattern in which leftist organizing includes a consciousness-raising component which causes women to report more sexual violence, which causes some political scientists then to say, leftist organizing in the community caused these people to be targeted for violence. Was that true? I don't actually think so, and the people that we spoke to did not think so either. They thought it was basically the same as other communities in the region in terms of the level of sexual violence that was actually occurring. So this is a go-to example for me, and it's not the only one.
Thank you so much, and thanks for modeling a pithy, interesting answer. Short answer.
That was 3 minutes. I just want people to know that was
very
I
impressive.
have so much more, though.
All right, so turning next to Lynn. Could you speak a bit about some of the challenges associated with making research accessible to the public, to policymakers, to practitioners, and also talk a bit about what researchers can do to improve communication amongst those groups?
So this gets to reporting. And I think in our digital age, reporting has become quite challenged. Let's go first to the researchers. The researchers definitely have a responsibility not to overstate data. If you study clinic data, it represents the women who come to the clinic. It doesn't represent the town, the province, the country. If you do qualitative data, and I'm going to be, since I have to be brief, I'm going to be overarching. You can beat me up later. Qualitative data is coalition of the willing. Those who are willing to talk to you. You aren't talking to the ones who don't want to come forward. Focus groups, it's the loudest in the focus group. And although there is a methodology for focus groups and you were supposed to have a moderator, in general, the focus groups that I've sat in and watched, it's generally the loudest one. And population-based data, you need to remind people that it represents your sampling frame. If you do South Kivu, but you missed one cluster, it doesn't represent that area. And you have to be very good about that. We need to be simple. We need to make sure that when we report data that is quite complicated, that the survivors understand it, the country can understand it, policy understand it, advocacy understand it, and media understands it. Now, that's a whole nother level. Media. In our CNN world, we can actually, as researchers, have sound bites created for us, even though we never talked to the person who's reporting. And so frequently, our data is misinterpreted. So let me give you an example. Let's look at the US military sexual violence data. If you saw the reports, they came out and all of the pictures were of, and I'm talking about the Air Force report that came out a year ago. If you looked at all of the pictures on the media, it was all Air Force women. If you looked at who reported what, they chose to report that 1 in 5 women had reported sexual violence in their time in the military. There was another number. There was 1 in 20. So let's do the math. 1 in 20 among a predominantly male military is 13,000 survivors. 1 in 5 in women is 12,000 survivors. So the Invisible War, the one that was nominated for an Academy Award, I think for Best Documentary, made those men even more invisible than you can imagine. But that's how the media chose to report it. And it wasn't that the military said that's the way it is. But again, it is also our responsibility to go back and correct these misconceptions. I recently was asked to review an article that was published, and I said, well, it's clinic data, there's nothing we can do. And I think it was just having been through this so many times that this person said to me, yes, there is. You can write a letter to the editor. And I sort of went, oh, perhaps I should. And I think that we do have to be more vocal, but we have to be constructive. We have to point out the positives and the negatives, but we also have to make sure that we focus it not as a personal attack, but to be professional and to say that for survivors and for policy, this isn't helpful. We need to be accurate.
Thank you. Mary, working with survivors of sexual violence requires absolutely that the researchers protect the rights and the safety and the dignity of the research subjects in that case. So what are some of the challenges that this creates for researchers, and what are some of the best practices that you've been able to develop?
I'll speak more generally, and I know that Shauna is going to give some very specific examples. The issue of safety of respondents in violence, gender-based violence research, those discussions really started about 20 years ago when, again, many of us who are in this room started realizing that women might be having adverse experiences as a result of participating in our research. And we realized that we heard stories of women who were beaten after disclosing domestic violence in a way that their husbands could find out about it, women who committed suicide after an interview, and we were worried that it could have been as a result of re-victimization and reliving the trauma. And this led to a whole series of best practices that are put together in the WHO ethical guidelines for doing research on women. A few years later, those were modified to specifically deal with researching, documenting, and monitoring sexual violence in emergencies. And several of the authors are right here, Hen Rice and Claudia Garcia Moreno. these are pretty complete, and they address a lot of the main issues. It's not clear to me, looking through the research that's been done in the last 10 years, how much they're being adhered to. A lot of the publications don't really explain what kinds of ethical guidelines were being followed. And to say the main characteristics is really to say that the safety of respondents is paramount. And if you can't guarantee the safety of your respondents and your field workers, you shouldn't do the research. This is literally a life and death issue for many people. And we're talking not just about physical retaliation, but also re-traumatization, and particularly in conflict situations now where a certain area will become very hot, like DRC, you hear stories of women being asked over and over and over again to tell the same story. And another ethical imperative is to make sure that when we are interviewing women who or men, victims of sexual violence, that we have access to care and support for them. So this is challenging in the best of circumstances, and in conflict situations, it is much more challenging, and in some areas, it may be impossible to guarantee. The issues have to do with, that are most difficult, I think, are maintaining confidentiality, doing it in a place and in a way that nobody else can find out what the woman has talked about or the man. Making sure that informed consent is really consent, and in situations like IDP camps, it's particularly challenging to really ensure that women or men know what they are exactly consenting to. The issue of interviewer training is incredibly important, and debriefing for interviewers, because we know that interviewers, researchers can also be really traumatized by the experience of listening to these stories. And then of course the support to respondents. So the implications of this are three main points for me. One, again, is it ethical to do research in an area where there are no services available or where we're not able to set them up? And the second, so in those cases, it might be more appropriate really to use service-based data like the GBV information system that was developed by IRC, UNFPA, and UNHCR. Second point is that really the benefits must outweigh the risk, and this is an ethical imperative. And I think Shauna mentions this. Her research in Sri Lanka was very interesting because after weighing all the potential risks to the informants about disclosing violence, sexual violence that could potentially ruin their lives if others found out about it, they decided not to do the research. Now, that doesn't happen very often. We usually find some way of saying, oh, of course, the benefits are so much greater. So we really need to be sort of intellectually, morally honest in that. And the final point, which Shauna has also discussed, is working with local groups at all stages of the research. And that's not just an ethical imperative. It also has to do with data collection and the quality of the data itself. Working with local groups can make sure that the data and the questions we're asking are relevant and useful for the local level. They improve the quality of data and safety, and then it also helps to make sure that the data are interpreted properly and appropriately.
Great. Thank you. Continuing on the theme of working with survivors, Shauna, could you speak a bit about some of the specific issues that arise when working with survivors of sexual violence in conflict settings in particular?
We've said no twice, actually, to interviewing survivors. Once was in the former Yugoslavia, and the other was in Sri Lanka. And I think it's really important. There's so many pressures for us to get quantitative data from donors, from our own institutions, from our needs for career advancement, for whatever, that I think we really need to ask ourselves, can we say no? Are we able to say, no, this is not safe, it's not ethical, we shouldn't do this? And we always do a safety and ethical and a feasibility study before we even start to think about doing research somewhere. I think it's particularly difficult. I think we need to pay particular attention to women and men who are living in internally displaced persons camps and resettlement villages. And especially those that are in certain countries where the situation for disclosing is so grave, where the situation there for women is so grave. And this is, again, situations vary, that there are places where the same survey would be low risk in one country and very unacceptably high risk in another country. I think there are additional ethical concerns when the investigators who initiate the survey are foreign to the community, and I think we need to pay attention to that, and I think often we can dangerously underestimate the risks without really careful communication with local people. When the risks are high, most women will choose not to disclose the information. And if you go ahead with the survey and the research findings are inaccurate and reported, then the women who did disclose will have taken risks and possibly endured harm for no benefit to anyone. And I think we need to take this very seriously. When law enforcement, justice, healthcare systems have been completely broken, sometimes the best strategy for women is to be silent, and we need to respect that culture of silence. And I'm not saying that women don't want to talk about violence, they do, but when we're doing population-based surveys and knocking on people's doors and asking women who wouldn't come forward to disclose on their own for whatever reasons they might perceive that to be of benefit, then we're really asking them to take a risk that may not be ethical and safe for them, and we have to respect that their silence can be protective. So how can we use research to advocate for women in settings where silence is protective, and how do we find a way to not place the burden of providing knowledge on the victims themselves? And I don't know if I have any time now, but I'll give the example of the former Yugoslavia. This was early on in the conflict in the early 90s, and right after the media picked up the enormous rapes in the former Yugoslavia, where they said, you know, the first week was 10,000, then 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 rapes. The special rapporteur on the former Yugoslavia wanted a mission to go in to see what was really going on, and there were 5 women physicians who went in. We fully expected that we would be interviewing victims, but as soon as we got there, 2 things on the day that we got there was, one is that a woman, a refugee in Spain, had committed suicide after talking to a psychiatrist, and we said, whoa, there are no safety nets here, there are no services in place, there's no safety for these women. And the second thing was the number of, quote, rape missions that were happening, and I think we're seeing that in the DRC now, where within a 3-month period, there were 12 rape missions. It was the EU, Amnesty, everybody, every human rights organization sent in a mission, lots of other organizations sent in missions. And not only is that unethical, I think, for re-interviewing women over and over again, but I also think that when we tell stories, I'm not talking about sexual violence or anything, but just in our daily lives, as we tell stories, we embellish. That's just a human feature. So that when you have women telling, the same woman telling the story over and over and over again, the story gets bigger. And that's just sort of a function of human storytelling. So we actually decided to look at, we were like, what are we going to do? We have 10 days and we have to, write a report. So I guess I have to tell the example later, right? Okay. Of what we did. Come back. All right.
Okay, thank you. So switching gears from working with survivors to large data sets, I'm going to start with Matt, who is a principal investigator for the Woman Stats Project, which is one of the largest and most comprehensive collections of data on the status of women in the world. So I was wondering if you could just speak briefly about some of the important findings that have come out of this massive data collection, and also about how the data either have been or could be used effectively for creating policy change.
Okay. So a couple of things. One of the first ideas, and this kind of gets back to the earlier point about good and bad countries or best practices. The idea that there is a good country or a bad country is not exactly accurate when you're looking at 250 different variables. Any given country is likely to have something that is comparably better than one of the other countries in the region. And the idea that that Norway or Sweden, as good as they are in certain aspects, that they have the best practice for Burundi or even Yugoslavia, is something that's even closer to home. It may not be very comparable for best practices in one area to look at the other. So being able to identify within regions that across all of these different variables that there's a great deal of variation, and that a sub-Saharan African country could look to one of their neighbors for a better way of doing something to improve the status of women. But that's I think, an important finding, to just be able to know that. Another one is just the absence of data. Rather than looking at what we can find, knowing that upwards of 50% of the variables in some of these countries, there's just no data. We don't even know where to start. Then we can then begin to work with advocates on the ground or with governments and say, this is information that needs to be provided, and give them a way of, here's another country, here's how they're collecting it, as a way of moving that information forward. Now, as far as actual findings, I guess the principal one with the book that was just published, the Sex and World Peace book, that the association and link between how women are treated within countries, that's a stronger predictor of the stability and security within that country than any other variable. You can look at democracy, you can look at the level of freedom, you can look at the amount of money. All of that can happen in a number of different environments that can be more or less beneficial to how women are treated, and to the overall security of that country. So that I think that's an important relationship to know that it exists. And there are others that I could go to. I don't know how much. You want to keep going, or there was another question. I forgot what the other question was. You said there were important findings, and there was one more.
Have the findings, or could the findings be leveraged for policy change?
Right. So from a policy change standpoint, again, we've had the opportunity to work with a number of different agencies in different countries who have looked at the data, and similar to what others have reported, once they see this is how my country is ranked, they've wanted to dispute that. And we've had instances, we were contacted by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about how the United States was ranked, and they challenged our data and our findings for the United States. They wanted it to change, and we said no. We need to improve, right? But New Zealand contacted us on something else, so with the Ministry of Education, and we had some inaccurate information in how we were rating the disparities in education between men and women. And so we were able to correct that information and make the scales more accurate. So this process of give and take, as we collect the data, disseminate the information, we have a very transparent scaling process, so you can see this is exactly the data we used, here's the exact rubric we used, here's how we came to the number, and then through that kind of negotiating process of getting better understanding of what's happening, we can either fix our errors or really force policymakers to address the issues that just aren't going to go away by wishing them to just disappear.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Ragnhild, so you've been working on a large cross-national data collection called the Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict Data Set, which in the spirit of full disclosure, I have also worked on with Ragnhild. Could you speak a bit about some of the challenges associated with collecting detailed data on sexual violence? The data set covers between 1989 and 2009. So what are some of the biases that you've had to confront in the process of collecting these data?
Yeah. There are several challenges, and one of the challenges is the fact that we are collecting data over a number of years. So, of course, we know that in recent years there's been growing attention to the problem of sexual violence and more reporting on this. So more NGOs, more news media, and more governments are paying attention to the problem of sexual violence, so the reporting has been increasing. And whether or not the prevalence of sexual violence is going up as much as the reporting, just in the number of reports, would indicate is not known. So we have to be very aware of that when we want to look into time trends. Now, it's some would say that if there's an increase in the prevalence of sexual violence over time, that is only because of increasing reporting, and that we can't say that. I think it's very important that we don't just simply, for instance, count the number of reports that come out or how often this is mentioned in the media and so on, because that, I think, will increase this potential problem of reporting on reporting rather than reporting of what's actually going on or what has been going on over time. So careful reading of the reports that have come out at different points in time is one way of dealing with this different attention from in the early 90s and up to today. Then there are other biases that we need to think about as well. So there are different ways of getting information and different information providers that might have different ways of collecting the information that they do collect, and also different reasons for presenting certain types of information versus other type of information. So for instance, using government sources, we always have to be aware that governments have their agendas, and they have friends and they have foes, and they might want to try to present information in a way that benefits them for their strategic interest. So we have to be aware of that. And we also, NGOs have their agenda and the things that they want to emphasize, and so that might also that can also represent a bias in terms of what is being reported on and how it's presented, what words are used, etc. And also other sources of data that people use, for instance, when there's a truth commission or some sort of justice process after a conflict, not everyone is heard and not everyone is asked, and we don't ask necessarily the same questions in one truth commission in one country as we do in another. So we have to take that into account, who is being asked, and so who ends up in the sample that we're dealing with in those cases. So the different, and then the last very important source of information is, of course, media sources. And they have a whole range of different potential biases there as well. Newspapers want to sell papers. Reporters can only go to certain places. They can't talk to everyone, and particularly not when a conflict is going on. So the reporting that's going on is very much a function of what the reporter can get access to and what else is going on at the same time. If there's something else that the reporter deems to be more interesting or more important or more likely to sell papers that day, maybe they will forget about something else that's going on. So these are things that we always need to take into consideration.
And can I just ask a question for clarification on these data sets? Are these available to the public, or are they available to certain researchers? Can you give us the kind of availability or accessibility in both cases?
Yes. Should I start? Yes. So the sexual violence and armed conflict data set will be made available to anyone who wants to use it, but it's not yet available because we are still in the process of analyzing and making sure the data is as good as we can get it. So the first part of the data was focused on African countries from 1989 to 2009. So all countries in Africa that had a conflict during that time period, looking at all the conflict actors in every year. And that data is the data that will be coming out first, but we are going to eventually release a whole global data set for the time period.
And is Afghanistan included?
Yes.
And Matthew, World Women Stats?
Yes, the data is freely available. Anyone can log on, create an account, view the information. You can see the scales are available to everybody, as well as the coding structure that was used and the original data that was used to produce them. So you can see the entire process from start to finish.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from the panelists before we open it up here? Because we really are committed to make sure we get a lot of questions and comments. else? Clarifications? All right, let's begin. And this is what I'm going to do today. Because we're not going to waste a minute, I'm going to ask our volunteers, because they're running up and down, if I'm going to do it in groups. So I'm going to do this group over here, and then that group up there, so you can be ready to give it to them. All right? And we're going to get a lot of questions out here today. So I'm going to depend on each of you, though. Please introduce yourself, your organization, and make your comment or question brief. But these are very important to the dialogue. Please.
Thank you. I'm Meredith Tertian from Rutgers University. I want to say how much I appreciate the really nuanced discussion, and especially for Shanna Swiss to remind us that we need to give the data back to the subjects. But I have a different question from the point of view of a researcher, and that is access to raw data. And I'm going to give you an example and name names. I can't get the IRC data for the mortality studies in the Congo. I don't really want the mortality data. I want the natality data, which they have and have never published. And no matter how many good connections I use, I can't get it. So could you comment on access to raw data?
Okay, next. You'll all be a part of this group, so.
Hi, my name is Matt Moore. I'm with the World Bank. Thank you very much. Excellent and honest conversation about research. Focused a lot on surveillance. I really appreciated Mary's comment early on that we need to look at evidence in lots of different forms and for different purposes. Curious if you could talk about how we might move from the next step in these difficult contexts from incidence and prevalence to better understanding the consequences of sexual violence in conflict zones, partly so that we can, for advocacy purposes, you can better understand the cost to individuals, communities, and countries, monetary, non-monetary, but also so that interventions are designed such that we're not just throwing the kitchen sink at people, but we're really giving what they need.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, Chris Dolan from Refugee Law Project. This is a subject I feel very passionate about, so I'm not sure I'll be very objective about it. But I wonder if you could speak a bit more to the politics of methodology. I think there's a tendency to kind of technicize the whole discussion. How does methodology relate to globalization? How does it relate to foreign relations? Who's doing the funding? Who are considered the experts? Who gets the money to do the multi-country studies? Who are the young scholars? No offense to any young scholars in the room, but I don't see very many young scholars coming from Uganda to here, for example. And I'm not pointing at this conference in particular, but in general, as one of those institutions that gets approached by students from all over to come and do their 6 weeks of field work, or 3 months, and then go back and be an expert on the subject. When we ask them to pay $100 a week for that access to experience, we're told, no, but they're bringing their expertise, they're bringing their skills. And we're thinking about, what about young Ugandans or young refugees who want to go the other direction? There is no opportunity, or virtually no opportunity. So I think there are a lot of issues in there, and I think Shana has spoken kind of most directly to some of that. And I will wrap up, but just to me, having been a researcher for 20 years or so, it's not just about the data collection. It's about how do you turn the data into information? And once you've got the information, how do you turn that into knowledge in the sense that it actually gets used? There's so much information out there, very little of it actually becomes internalized and articulated as knowledge and as changes in practice. So I think for me, a discussion about research methodology has to be a discussion about those 3 stages: the data collection, the information generation, and the transition from information to knowledge. And I'd love your comments on any of that. Thank you.
I hope we can quote you there.
Thank you. I'd want to echo a lot of what Chris said just now. Susanna Sirkin at Physicians for Human Rights. Very interesting panel, but my question has to do with the questions that we're asking in the research. And there seems to be mostly in these discussions an assumption that we're looking at prevalence and we're getting numbers. And I know that it was much more nuanced than that. But I'm really interested in what are the new research questions or areas that we don't really understand in terms of, for example, looking at children born of rape, for example, looking at attitudes. What do survivors want? What do they need? How do we unpack the variety of issues around justice. These are the kinds of questions, reparation. This is a very different kind of research. And another question that I have just to finish up on this is that in looking at the way that we use the research, we have to go back again to the question, so that if we're asking about war crimes, for example, we might ask a very different type of question and indeed be very interested in looking at the absolute worst stories, the kind of stories that you said you heard that you'd never heard before, as opposed to a big scan and large numbers of people that we're interviewing.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, and your group up there, please manage them.
Hi, my name is Carla Suarez. I'm a doctoral student in political science at Dalhousie University, Canada. I just want to thank Chris for his comments, and it kind of sparked a lot of thoughts in my head that I often have. I'm about to begin work in South Sudan. South Sudan's a new country for me, although I've worked in northern Uganda and other parts of Africa. But ethical dilemmas are those things that keep me up at night. It's what I worry about all the time. So I just wanted to pose a question out here about, and kind of expand our conception of ethics to reciprocity with community members. So as a young scholar, I'd like to get your advice on tactics that you've used, things that have worked and not worked in the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Beth Delaney. I'm an advisor to one of the executive directors at the World Bank. We represent 14 countries, 9 of which are Pacific Island countries. I just wanted to pick up on, I think it was Mary's point around more data evidence versus action now. And this need to be able to influence policymakers kind of opportunistically, 24-hour news cycles, sort of set terms in government, etc. And I'm just wondering how you balance the kind of that seeking of perfection at a technical level and ensuring that you don't create a kind of an incentive for policymakers not to do anything.
Hi, my name is Clémence Pinault, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Sorbonne. So I have one of them. The first is a comment. We talk a lot about the need of getting more evidence. For me, that's very debatable. So I mean, it's been taken for granted throughout this entire conference. Also because it makes you miss out on other forms of violence that are less visible and that you could not collect throughout surveys. I directed a survey myself. And also I would like to talk about the chain of production of knowledge, because the results that you get depend on how you phrase the questions, how you design your survey. And oftentimes you notice that UN agencies or donor agencies who commission those surveys already know what they want to know. So they're just asking you to confirm, to design something, and then if the numbers don't really, if you're trying to be too rigorous, then maybe throughout the process, in the editing process, maybe they can, change the phrasing so that the numbers can mean something that they were not meant to mean. So I would like you guys to address that issue of production of knowledge, and also the fact that oftentimes this sort of desire to produce data that is comparable throughout countries makes us miss the specificities of the context. And I had to struggle to include men in the survey that I directed. I had to struggle to make it specific to South Sudan because people wanted me to design something that could be applied to Zambia.
Okay.
Now, not many comment points anyway.
Thank you very much. Okay, keep going.
Yes, my name is Maria Eriksson.
Could you please stand up?
Okay.
Thank you.
I have first a question for Lynn. And you said before that you were having a very quick comment, but you said something that if you do qualitative interviews, that you only talk to people who want to talk to you. I just want to develop on that, because, I mean, surely when you do surveys, you don't force people to participate. And I think there's a considerable amount of force involved also in qualitative interviews, in that you often go through NGOs to help you out, to talk to victims that are already beneficiaries and they are actually forced to do it. So I don't think that is actually a difference in terms of the enforcement, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So I just want to develop on that. And then also I'm wondering, seeing this panel, where is anthropology, where is ethnography, where are that kind of research that look at the different dynamics around victimhood and also within armed groups, etc. I mean, not a single one in the panel. It's here, so just a question to the one setting up the panel. Because I also think we need to realize the limits of interviewing, whether it's in survey types or even interviews, one-time interviews, and the kind of data we get from that. And I can see that very much in my material. If I had gone for numbers and would have been based on the one-time interviews I did, because I also did more interviews with several people, I would get a totally distorted number in terms of forced recruitment, because everybody would say the first time that I was forced to be recruited. So it was just after talking to them several times that you actually find out that that was not the case. And I think it's anthropologists who have really shown these kinds of dynamics, and I think it's not used enough. And there's also a question, what, according to you who are doing more quantitative research, what is the role of anthropology, and why is the work of anthropology so seldom cited in these more quantitative data? Because there are people already out there who knows these structures, and that can be used, I think.
Thank you very much. And we're going to take 2 more questions, and then we'll go to that after the next round. Okay, these 2, and then.
Thank you very much for the presenters. I just wanted to add or to note on the issue, somebody mentioned about defining gender-based violence depending on the cultural context. For us in Kenya, we decided to include other types of violence in our GBV center because we realized most of the centers were looking at sexual violence because the previous studies had shown that there's usually they usually exist together. You have sexual violence at the same time as physical and psychological. So right now is when we are trying to look at a description of the services for the last 1 year and we want to see the outcome. But it's interesting, in Kenya there's a community that, there's a small community where it's almost okay to have kind of forced, where a woman is not supposed to willingly accept sex. The guy is you're supposed to pretend you don't want, and the guy is your husband is supposed to kind of come in by some kind of force. So in that particular community, I'm interested to know at what point is it now gender-based violence? And that is a community that probably I would like to study separately, but you can see the context we're talking about. The other thing I wanted to mention is on provision of services ethically, for us, we are insisting that if you're going to study a group, you want to identify survivors in a particular group, you must then provide services. So identify where services are being offered for these survivors, cater for it, budget for it, and ensure that they are referred and they get treated, than leaving them hanging. And I think that's very important. And I liked the contributor who talked of the participatory approach in studies. The last comment is the issue of use of media. Media can be a bit tricky. I know, for American media, actually you don't get much information of what's going on around the world. Really, really, very, very, very. So you cannot rely on American media. Thank you.
Thank you for that ethnographic observation. And we'll have one last one in this round, and then I promise we'll get everybody in today to the conversation.
My name is Vesna Ivanovic. I'm coming from the Balkans, working in OSCE mission to Skopje, and listening to the panelists and now to the discussion, I wanted to share experience and some thoughts that I have.
Very brief.
I will be very brief. In 2001, with my organization, we were involved in redeployment of the police officers back to the former crisis area. And this crisis area, they were very closed, so we had to go through the religious and community leaders. So I was thinking about the same approach when we want to do the surveys or any interviews. I work as a gender focal point, and when I want to reach vulnerable groups and women in those communities, usually what I can do the best is to contact the religious and community leaders. And they then give green light to the women in the community to participate, and they feel integrated. So that was just my short comment.
All right, how are we going to do this? We are not going to answer every question. Again, we're trying to get the ideas out there. It's stimulating. We see where the problems are. And I'd like you each to take one of these that you would like to respond to. I know you want to answer more than that. But for the sake of time and for the sake of getting more questions out there, I'm going to ask you to take one of them, succinctly answer it, and I'm going to ask who would like to step forward first. All right, please.
I want to speak to your question, Chris, and a couple of people mentioned that too. What is data? What is the information? How do we use it? How do we create knowledge out of it? And I want to go back to just talking a little bit about the team. I'm going to harp on this, working with local teams and building the capacity of local teams. The teams that we work with are the people that would be hired to be the interviewers. We're not working with the academics from the University of Liberia or anything like that. These are the people that you would go into the community and you would hire them to be the interviewers. And it's pretty exceptional to work with that group and have them become really good, excellent researchers and able to produce data and use it in the future. And I'm just going to give you one example. That of one piece of data that we use. So looking at the teen, we did reproductive health and child survival on every, the outcome of every pregnancy. And we found some surprising things. And so by being able to disaggregate the girls in high school from the girls in the community who weren't going to high school broadly, we found big differences. I'm going to bring in the issue of languaging as well, which speaks to somebody else. So the questions were written by women who lived through the conflict and knew how to design the questions and knew how women talked about these issues and knew the difference between rural and urban, and I'm assuming there a level of education is how I'm making that distinction, how women talked about it. And every question was written in Liberian English for rural women. So for the issue of pregnancy, they asked a large number of questions, but they said, did you ever get belly, which is have you ever become pregnant? And then they asked, any belly spoil, which is the way Liberian rural women talk about miscarriage or abortion. And then they said, well, did it come out by itself or did you take it out? And the interesting data that was found in that situation is that the teenage girls in the community actually became pregnant more often, had a higher pregnancy rate, than the girls who were in high school. However, when you look at the bellies that spoil in those two groups, the teenagers in the community roughly had a 16% rate, and you're going to always have to assume some baseline miscarriage rate in that statistic. But the girls that were going to high school had almost 2/3, so over 60%. So they took that information and they've used it to lobby the Minister of Health, the Minister of Education, to change policy, education policy for girls, so that girls who become pregnant can stay in school. And they've made some progress, and they're still working on it. So that's just when looking at the whole picture, who collects the data, who interprets the data, who understands the data, and that's not an easy part of this either, and who can use the data and how is it used.
Great, thanks. Very succinct. Amy, step forward.
Go.
Yes.
I also select Chris's question, but the other piece of it. The idea of the reciprocity with young scholars and not just scholars in the Global South, but activists, service providers. I think there's a big discrepancy we find in those who are doing the research come in and do it, and then those who are going to use the research but haven't been involved in the process and don't really understand what's going on, and a lot of times it's really mystified. And an experience that I've been involved in for years that might be relevant here is after the multi-country study, the WHO study on domestic violence and women's health, we developed a research manual for how to do this kind of research, including participatory and qualitative methods, and then developed a course for researchers and activists and service providers. And it's a course that we developed together with regional universities, with MRC of South Africa, with Addis Continental School of Public Health, with Makerere. And so that course, and we did it also in Spanish. So for years, we've been giving a 2-week course to service providers and activists. And the point is not to turn them into researchers, it's to allow them to engage with researchers in a knowledgeable way and as equal partners. So that's been a really good experience. And 2 other aspects of that. One is that we did it with the GBV Prevention Network. So again, we're not the ones who are choosing who joins the course or who's involved. It really, you had to be involved with an organization that is working on gender-based violence and be able to show that you're going to use it. And we were also able to get seed money so that those who took the course were afterwards able to do some of their own pieces of research and present them at the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. I think that's might be the sort of thing that could be done here.
Thanks for the concrete example there, too. It helps. Dara, I think you're going to step in here.
Yeah, I wanted to respond briefly to the question about reciprocity and norms of reciprocity when one is doing research. And I think this is an extremely important norm, but it presents special challenges for young scholars, as we're calling ourselves, or maybe doctoral students who are doing fieldwork on their own and don't have the funding that a large agency has to do these kinds of major projects where one invests back in a community. And so this is something I've confronted in my own work, and there are small ways that people suggest that one can perform the norm of reciprocity, for example, by giving talks at local universities at the end of your research, and developing close relationships with the people that you work with, research assistants, translators. And I've certainly done some of those, but I think there are special challenges that have to be recognized. Something that was suggested to me was to translate back into local languages my work when I was finished writing it. And I was meeting with a local women's organization in East Timor when I was doing my research there and asked if they had someone that they might recommend I could use. And I was told yes, and that the rate is $1. And I said, oh, $1 a page? And I was told, no, $1 per word. And my case study for East Timor was 30,000 words. So that exceeded by orders of magnitude my budget for my entire dissertation research. So that wasn't going to happen. So I think that was just by way of saying I think there are special challenges, particularly if you are a doctoral student kind of doing this on the cheap, as it were, as opposed to doing this as part of a large agency that has just a lot more money to do those sorts of things.
I think Amelia, you mentioned, and then Lynn after.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo that, and also just say very briefly that it reflects a really problematic thing in political science, and I don't know other fields well enough to speak to them, but there's a norm that we all, I think those of us who attempt to do complicated work in settings that are not native to us, there's a norm that we'll publish on our own and that we'll go out there and be really macho and do it ourselves and gather all the data and interpret all the data. And essentially that leads, I think, very frequently, you know, in my own case, certainly in many cases I've seen, to folks who do fieldwork in political science not being able to formally acknowledge partners, not working themselves into local networks, because the incentives are there, but they're very small. The thing I actually wanted to talk to was Maria's question about anthropology and ethnography, which thank you for asking that question. And the reflection I had was that especially in subnational studies, you know, we have got to be sort of telling the story, even when we are using quantitative data. We've got to be telling the story of those data in a much richer way. And I think that what that means is more more citation, more cooperation, more acknowledgement of both sort of academic, anthropological and ethnographic expertise and local knowledge. And that gets elided a lot in a context where numbers are seen as, the coin of the realm, as I said earlier, where numbers are the thing that is incentivized and the thing to which money is attached.
So I'm going to try and answer two. One, because one was directed at me. Susanna and a couple of other people mentioned that these studies on gender-based violence need to include other things, and indeed, our studies are very comprehensive, sometimes up to 180 questions, and it includes consequences of sexual violence, both physical and mental. We look at mental health symptoms. We don't look at diagnosis. You can't do that. You can't do symptom screening. Diagnostic screening. You can do symptom burden, and that's what we tend to focus on. We look at opinions. We look at human rights abuses. We look at attitudes. We look at access to care. We look at reasons why access to care wasn't there, and we look at basic needs, as well as what some of these people want for justice, those who are survivors and those who are not. The reason we do that is because it adds ethnographic data. It adds context, and that's important. I think, Maria, you asked me about enforcement of interviews. I don't like that word. We never force people to respond. We don't use referrals. In our data, we do randomized household, spin the bottle. That's the direction we go, every third household in a village. They have the option to opt out. But what I mean about Coalition of the Willing is that we also ask, do you want to tell us more? And so those who are willing to tell us more, tell us more. Those who don't want to tell us more than what they've already done on the quantitative aren't. And those are the people that I think that we're not getting the data from that may be important. But there's nothing that we can do about that because ethically we have to allow people to not respond so that our response rates might be less in some places. We also have to allow people to skip questions as ethics review committees tell us that we have to, and as ethical researchers, we should allow.
Thank you. Anyone else want to? Yes, please,
I think the most important thing I think that we should take maybe from this meeting and also from the discussion here is how important it is to look at sexual violence from through various different lenses and with different entry points. And so although maybe more people up here right now have talked about numbers and surveys, and I've talked about cross-national comparisons, that doesn't mean that other ways of doing research are less important in any way. And I think it's very important that we collaborate much more than we are doing currently. But I think that we're making progress, and it's not all that bleak. And I think the most sort of important foundation for being able to collaborate more is to increase the transparency in what we're doing, how we're collecting data, how we're going about producing the knowledge that we're producing. And so for the research that I'm involved in, that's been a very important premise, that we don't know exactly always if we are drawing the right conclusion in terms of the reporting versus what we think the truth is, if there's such a thing. But that we always document how we came to the number or the number that we come up with. What is the basis for that? So that anyone who wants can go in and see they base this on these types of sources. From that, they translated that into meaning this. And you as a researcher going over this, you can challenge this and you can say, I choose to emphasize this source that they've used over that other source. And so I will manipulate or use that background documentation that they have for a different purpose. So as long as we are transparent in these things, I think that we can challenge each other and we can build more knowledge. So, and I think that what was said before about the limits in terms of resources and how to build competence and bring in other voices than the sort of American grad students and so on is very important. But we have to realize that there's a resource question here, and when we are trying to make large research projects, we should then try to bake in elements there of competence building in the areas where we are doing research, because it's hard you can't put that burden on each and every grad student. I don't think.
Thank you.
Yes.
And just to continue on the idea of transparency, I think it's absolutely critical, rather than any particular organization or individual who takes the assumption that they're just simply disseminating information, that they're just producing information as if it's in its final form and can't be critically looked at, or that it should just be consumed. And that's a problem with the way we interact, both as researchers, as those who are practitioners or government officials. We take a very similar approach. That the idea is that here's the data that's been collected. This is the rubric that's used in order to generate the data. Here are the data points that we've come up with. It's all available and able to be challenged. Again, different judgment calls rather than manipulation. Right?
Yeah.
Certainly, we don't manipulate data.
We torture the data to speak.
Exactly. Judgment calls. I like that word. But there may be more information that you're privy to that you can add to it, and in which case we'd ask if you're making adjustments, please let us know so we can make those corrections. But if we're constantly interrogating and questioning the data rather than just simply producing and consuming, we'll probably have better outcomes with that. As far as accessing additional reports, oh, wow, I wish we could figure that out. Access to Interpol data would be wonderful. Access to any number of different reports that would probably make countries not so happy to have that data out would be wonderful to have. And some of that comes from the cooperation of resources. If we're able to triangulate information from different agencies that are on the ground and have experience in multiple different cities, we may not be able to produce the most accurate number, but we may be able to kind of rank order where a country exists. And at that point, if the country is interested in improving that information, there's another researcher with different information, that maybe we can begin to enter into a dialogue and begin to improve that. So from our perspective, we gathered data for about 7 years, and it's only been the last 5 years that we've been actually producing reports. And so it's based on the best data we have available. And we know that it's not complete, and it's the beginning of a dialogue, the beginning of a process that we hope will continue.
Excuse me. That side of the room, please.
Hi, I'm Aisling Swain, the Transitional Justice Institute, University of Ulster in Northern Ireland. Just 2 quick comments. One is, I enjoyed the comment about the need to focus on other places, not just those that we talk about. And I suppose would like to hear more about that, because we tend to, what way is the way the research agenda right now is going, how is that influencing what we're understanding to be violence, gender violence and conflict? If you take, for example, the Northern Ireland case, it's not somewhere that you would put in the box of that's a country or that's a conflict where gender violence took place, but it did, associated with the conflict. It may not have taken place across ethno-national lines, but associated with the conflict and associated with paramilitary violence, it was there, but then it doesn't get talked about in the same way that we talk about other places. The second question then about the research process and the identity of the researcher. So I've been a researcher and I've been the researched. I've been an academic scholar who's gone out and does research. I'm a practitioner who gets researched by academic scholars. Does it matter who you are when you do that research, practitioner or scholar?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicole Gehring from Wayne State University. My question is actually directed at Dara, I hope that's okay, regarding perpetrator interviews and the specific concerns about security might be present in those contexts with people who have been part of a group who might still be in touch with others in that group, and the situation you might put them in by asking them questions about their conflict behavior.
Let's keep it moving, please.
Hello, I'm Amanda Blair. I'm from the University of Chicago. And so I just had a question about time in all of these stories. How do we deal with difficulties with reporting, and especially if we're looking at change over time, not only memory and recollection, but self-reporting, delayed reporting, false reporting, all of these things. How does time work into all of these stories, especially as researchers, since it's so important, and how do you deal with these challenges?
It's the coalition of people sitting in the middle over here, passing the mic. My name is Leah Gates. I'm from American University, so I had a nice little bike ride this morning to get over. And the question I want to ask is about objectivity, which I think is important to discuss in any methodological conversation. My personal philosophy is objectivity is something to which we should aspire, but never assume we have achieved, right? We should aspire to it by declaring those biases that we know about and trying to accommodate for them, right? But that our day-to-day strategy should be more about honesty, right? Rather than saying that we've sort of achieved total objectivity, which I think goes to mask some of the political and privilege issues that Chris is raising, right? When we say that we've sort of engaged, we've done objective research, right? But I want to sort of operationalize that concept as a question about choosing research and choosing cases and choosing subjects that are useful, right? Either as a factor of time, right? Things that are, something can still be done about, right? Or that are useful to us for other reasons. I think when we talk about caring about how our research is going to be used, right? In order to prevent misuse, it also is implying that we certainly have objectives, right, for how we want it to be used, and the extent to which we should declare and engage those things.
Great. And this gentleman right here in front of you, please. These two, and then we're going up to that corner.
Thanks very much. Paul Kirby, University of Sussex. Since I'm going to carry on Chris's line, I want to preface this by saying I think all the discussion that's happening is not only valuable but essential. So it's not an attack on that kind of research, but I want to push on the political theory background to some of these things in two dimensions. One, which is the political theory that underlies the concepts, right? The definition of rape as something that can happen in a marriage is not a correction of a data error. It's a consequence of a political struggle, right? And there are lots of other aspects of data which are based on political concepts. And there are also all kinds of political consequences, right? Defining communities in terms of males and females is not politically neutral. Neither is dividing them in terms of ethnic groups, okay? So what I'd like to ask is about how you factor those dimensions into your work in concrete terms. Thank you.
And one more very brief question right here, and then we'll go up to the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Elisa Portionajera, human rights activist for Guatemala. My question also addresses the neutrality that is being presented by you all as an important way of focusing more on objective research. I wanted to ask you if that wouldn't create some outcomes that would be negative, because it took us so long to raise the awareness of women's human rights and the unequal power relations that are so much a cause of all of these atrocities that are happening. And my question would be addressed to that issue, and also to the researchers that are coming to different states. What are those samples of population? Are you following up on the status of those people that are being used for the research information, knowledge gathering? And also,
I think we'll have to stop there because I have so many questions. Forgive me, but please, behind you there's about 10 questions.
Francine, I would like to mention this research gap in DRC. We don't have the right prevalence of what sexual violence is, simply because researchers come and they presume that everybody involved in the research have the same understanding of what sexual violence is. But this is not true, because you can ask 10 Congolese women, have you ever been raped, and who was the author? You'll probably find none, not because they haven't been raped, but because they think that to be raped, you need to be taken by 5 rebels in the bush. So there's a need to redefine sexual violence before collecting data to have the right prevalence.
Thank you. Please keep it moving up here. Yes?
Tim Shan from Sonke in South Africa. Thank you for a great panel. I'm really pleased that so many of these issues are coming out. Just want to push back a little bit on this, the way in which we're talking about reciprocity. I think it's really important that we share and go back to communities and try to translate research, and I understand as a PhD student myself some of the challenges around the budgetary elements of that. But I think reciprocity is really about who owns the data set. Where does the data set sit? Does the data set sit in the Global North, or does the Global South have access to the data? Who gets published? Who's on the papers? Who gets to speak at the conferences? So I would just encourage us to think more broadly about the things that we can control and do have access to, and are slightly at a more macro level, but are nevertheless are important. But my specific question is, as somebody who's a practitioner and also sits in an academic institution, I feel that sometimes those two worlds struggle to understand each other, and I think on both sides. And so I wonder, how do we continue to bridge that gap, I think, between kind of the world of academia and the essential work that the world of academia is doing, and the world of practitioners on the ground, and who sometimes are also researchers, but often sometimes struggle to understand and speak to and use that language. And how can we work together better?
Thanks, Tim.
Good morning, I'm Colonel Diop from Senegal. Don't you think that we need more researchers in uniform for them who are also otherwise considered as being the principal perpetrators to also be part of the storytelling and to collect the data, to develop the information, the knowledge, and ultimately to develop in-house policies and strategies, which is the only way we can have sustainable results. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thomas. I'm with the U.S. military. My uniform looks a little different today. I'm sure you've all seen it. So I got two questions, and but before I ask them, I'm going to give you a little background about how we in a small unit military think and approach these very problems.
Then you only have one question if you're going to give
Okay, just one question then. So we have our data collectors as a separate cell from our analysts. That avoids making the data look like what we want it to look like. So it provides our implementers, our operational arm, and our planners the ability to have a clean set of facts to deal with and not just emotions. So our planners run that data through policies to make sure everything works right, and we come up with a series of plans. We pick the best plan solution based on the resources we have available, and we implement. Now, a couple of examples from yesterday in the Global South. The solutions came without research. It came from the bottom up. We saw the film. Everyone knows about Liberia. There wasn't a lot of data and research and planning ahead of time. It was, oh my God, we've got a problem, we got to fix it. And from the bottom up, the solutions came. And then a couple of other solution sets we heard about yesterday from the UK as a very dynamic action arm that they mobily place in different places. And then the Germany solution set involves not only the victim or the survivors, but also the perpetrators. I think that's a very, very needed piece as well. So that's the long way around to go to ask my question is, how do you effectively integrate your findings into specific solutions? Or if I can frame it a little differently, how do you apply those lessons learned into actionable solutions? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Carol Agengo. An independent consultant, a lawyer from Kenya. A lot of my questions have been touched on, but I want to go back to what Dr. Chris Dolan asked, and that was on two fronts. The inclusivity of the knowledge from the South, and the second thing is, where does this research go? And my question is, listening to the panel 6, it's like research is the panacea for SGBV? Is that the only method of addressing SGBV? And how do we create a balance between funding priorities on the one side, culture, state and politics, appreciation of local knowledge again, in terms of informing methodology? And I speak from experience of having worked for 2 donor organizations based in the US, and the challenge was always the research was, the need for research always came from the West. It never came from bottom up. And I think the gentleman who spoke before me said that there are ways in which solutions can be found without the research. And then finally, who are the primary consumers of this information? One of the other challenges that I faced, especially with the last donor organization that I worked with, is that you'd get a proposal from Harvard, from all these institutions of higher learning based in the US, and if you said that this research had been done last year by a similar institution, it would always be trashed. Everybody wanted to create new knowledge. And I want to come back to the question that, to the comment that I think Dara said about translation. Why is it not included in the cost of the research? Because if you're having the research and you're speaking to, if you're bringing the research to Kenya that has 42 languages and you do not translate it to the national language, then that research will be for use in the institution based in the West, not in the South. And I want to just give one short example, which is, I think I've asked to speak for the 3 days. I've only been allowed once. One of the things that we learned, the last donor organization, not the last, the previous one, they were doing a research on FGM, and they sent 2 ladies from New York to come to Elgeyo Marakwet in Kenya that has no roads, it has absolutely nothing. So seeing a white person is like a movie to them. And you come and ask them, have you been mutilated? What do you think of FGM? And they sit and stare because one, there's the dynamic, the power dynamic of bringing the money from the West. And so you're thinking, what's the right answer so that I can then get the money? The second thing was there was no respect for the cultural dynamics. When we spoke to them as men separately, the men said, we don't want FGM. But this group was coming from a perspective where FGM was being pushed by the patriarchal, the patriarchal undertones of this society. When the group got together, the men said, this is our culture. But we realized, based on information that was coming from the ground, you need to separate the men from the women, and they will tell you exactly what they want. So I think there's need to respect local knowledge, and there is knowledge that has been generated in the South, and I think it's high time that the West began to appreciate that.
We haven't talked about it yet, but our intention is to have Missing Piece 2 in Nairobi, and I hope you will be a part of that panel because I think it brings forward a missing piece right here. I have now left the task. I think I had 15 questions, and we have 3 minutes. But I wanted to emphasize how many important questions. I mean, this is really what we've been talking about for 3 days. It's getting these ideas on the table. Thank you all for those important questions, comments from different disciplines, different stakeholders, different parts of the world. We definitely have a power dynamic, not only in the issues of sexual violence, but the study of sexual violence, how we communicate it, who gets the funding. We have what I think is a whole nother panel on power and sexual violence and how we sort this out. And it is a very difficult undercurrent, and if I may say, I think actually quite a theme that has gone through the 3 days, and I don't want to take away from the last panel where we're going to summarize those things. So in 2 minutes and 31 seconds, because you don't know back here, we can see how much time we have.
Can I do
you have a comment. I'm not going to ask for everybody's comment, but if you have a burning comment, please summarize.
On the time thing, 10 years is generally considered reliable memory, although if you have a catastrophic event, you'll remember it much longer. So you have to decide what your timing is on that. The person who asked about researcher versus practitioner, I take this back to doctor-patient. I'm a better doctor because I was a patient. I'm also a better caregiver because I was the mother of a very sick child, which also made me a better doctor. So I think it all cycles. And then finally, going where places are of interest or not of interest, I don't know how to answer that. There are many places that I feel research is important. You either have to find a private donor or someone of interest, but if it's not of interest to the global community or to policymakers, you won't find funding.
I think the question on objectivity also is really fascinating. And so I'd like to go back to the question is, does it matter if you're a survivor of violence or not? And I think that the idea that you can be less objective or you can't be rigorous because you've survived violence, that's something that I find really problematic. We never ask researchers on diarrhea or on cancer. We never discredit them because they have had cancer, because they've had diarrhea. And I realize that myself, I've never publicly disclosed that I'm a survivor of sexual abuse for the same reason that my research might be disqualified. And I now regret that because I think it's actually made me a better epidemiologist and better researcher. And my colleagues also, I think it makes them better researchers. And that it's transparency, the objectivity is being able to be transparent about your methods, how you reach conclusions, and that's sort of the source by which we should measure rigor.
Thank you, Matt. Dara, I'm going to send it back to you as chief moderator here.
All right. Well, we have 12 seconds. So I will just thank the panelists on stage and thank the audience for a very lively discussion. And I look forward to continuing these discussions later. So, appreciate it.